Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Is that close enough? Okay. So I'm going to tell you all about my mother's story. My mother, Masha Nachmanson, who survived against the odds. She survived horrendous atrocities perpetrated by the Nazis and their collaborators. But she survived, because on this clip, you actually see her arriving in Malmö, Sweden, on the 28th of April 1945, just 2 weeks before the end of the war. This is her. I'm incredibly lucky to have found this clip in the archives in the Swedish film industry. Here she is, Masha Nachmanson, born Stern. She was born into a very strict Orthodox family. My grandfather was a Hasid, a very strict Orthodox man. She was number 8 of 12 children, and they were very poor. But even in spite of the poverty, she had a very happy childhood, because the parents and the family were very supportive, very loving, and very respectful of each other's difference of opinion. My mother was a bit of a rebel. She was born in Lodz. Should have said that. On the 30th of December, 1920. Lodz, in those days, in fact, the whole of Eastern Europe had a lot of anti-Semitism, pogroms, restrictions on what Jews could do, their professions. My mum was a very good student, was hoping to go to university, but she knew that it would be very restrictive and she may not get in, even though she had a scholarship. But on the 1st of September 1939, when the Nazis Germany invaded Poland, and Poland surrendered just within a week, apart from Warsaw, which took a little bit longer, anti-Semitism became much, much worse. This is just an example of how the Nazis and the local people who supported the thoughts, the Nazi doctrine, were very happy to support the humiliation of Jews and many other minorities a bit later on. The Nazis also introduced anti-Jewish laws. They were based on the Nuremberg laws, but they were adapted to each country because the Nazis liaised with the local people what would be the most effective laws against each country. They all differed. But these are just some examples. Marriage and sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews were forbidden. Jews had to wear a yellow star. Not only wear, they had to buy it and make it and put it on their outside clothing, simply to be recognized easily. They were dismissed from the jobs because they were Jewish. They were not allowed to partake in any of the niceties of life because they were Jewish. And they had to give all their valuables to the Nazis, to the Gestapo. In my mum's case, I mentioned they were poor. The most valuable item in their home, apart from the books, was a sewing machine, which my grandmother used to make the clothes for her 12 children. That had to be handed over. You will hear my mum speak in various clips. I have dubbed it, and you'll hear my daughter's voices on it. But it is also subtitled.
My brother, only 15 years old, was summoned to the Gestapo headquarters. They accused us of hiding money. It was totally untrue. We had no money to hide. He was so badly tortured. When they finally realized they had the wrong person. They threw him out onto the pavement. We could hardly recognize him.
This was my uncle Moshe. The Nazis also created ghettos. Now, ghettos were nothing new. They had existed in Europe for centuries, but they tended to be, pre-Second World War, areas where people of similar religion, culture, identity preferred to live close by to each other. But the Nazis created ghettos for the simple reason to control the Jews. In Łódź, as the Polish say, the area chosen was the Baluti area, which was the industrial area. And in this small area, within 1 month, they managed to push in 160,000 people, Jews mostly, in 1 month by sheer intimidation and threats. The area also, the Baluti area, the Łódź ghetto area, also had a major road going through it, which was important for the Nazi war effort. And therefore, the area was divided in 2 parts. And a fence around each part with a bridge across so that they could move from one area to the other, working and living all within the area of the ghetto. Overcrowding, as you can see. Now, the Nazis also played a very clever psychological game. They instructed the Jews to create their own administration. That is, they were responsible for building schools, printing money, ghetto money, creating their own police force, and law, and they also had a courthouse with judges. Chaim Rumkowski, who you see here, was the head of this Judenrat, but he was not the ruler. Hans Bieboff, he was a Nazi administrator. He lived outside, and he was a ruthless and corrupt man. Anything that he said had to be followed. My mum had to, if everybody had to find a job, because if you didn't, thank you. If you didn't have a job, you couldn't earn any money to buy the meager food that was available in the ghetto. My mum, who, when the war started, was 19 years old, her dreams of university were shattered, but she was lucky enough to get a job as an assistant to one of the judges in the ghetto court. This is actually a photograph from that court. But very early on, Hans Bieboff commanded the judges to give the death penalty on a young man who had simply stolen a piece of bread to feed his starving family. That's against the Jewish law. And apart from anything else, how can you possibly do that on somebody who's trying to save his family? The judges chose to go underground. Hence, my mum's job came to an end. No job, no money. But she was lucky because she found a job in one of the many laundries. I didn't mention that Łódź was a city known for its textile industry. And because of that, there were many laundries supporting the factories. And she got a job in one of the offices. Again, I'm so lucky because this is the only photograph I have of my mum or any of my dead, murdered relatives. This was saved somehow and given to me, sadly, a few years after my mum passed away. Most of these people didn't survive. So conditions in the ghetto were terrible. Overcrowding, as you can see here. Also, because they were forced into the ghetto in such speed from their homes, anything that they could take with them, they did, but sometimes they didn't even have time to do that. And if they didn't have a job in the ghetto, what would they live off? So they were selling the few items that they had taken with them to exchange for money. Soup kitchens were formed, and people were desperate, digging with their hands to try and get anything to eat.
1942 was a very cold winter. Temperatures were down to minus 30 degrees. People went out at night to try and find some food. There was never enough for everyone. The SS often came at night, grabbed people from the queue and transported them directly to the gas chamber. But the next night, people went out again because the pain of hunger was stronger than the fear of being caught. It was a matter of survival. We used every method possible in our fight for life. We wanted to believe that the war was going to end. And that the enemy would not succeed in annihilating us all. The will to live is strong. And it is strongest when the possibility of survival is at its limit.
During this winter, and in one of these queues, one of my aunts, Hannah, was taken away. And in 1942 was the beginning when the Nazis started to use gas. She was carted away in one of those vans to Chelmno concentration camp, which was the closest to Lodz. Also during this winter, my two grandparents, Yitzhak and Yenta, died from tuberculosis because the conditions in the ghetto were just impossible to survive, starvation and diseases. And also an aunt and uncle of mine, Meir and Yafa. And they had two little boys, my cousins, Simon and Jacob. They were 6 and 9 years old. They survived the winter, but they were being looked after in the orphanage now, in the Lodz orphanage. 1942 in January was also the infamous Wannsee Conference. For the Nazis, the Jews were just simply not dying fast enough or in large enough numbers. So they had to think of a solution, the final solution, which meant that they were going to make up lists of Jews who were of no use as slave labor. They needed slave labor. Now that Wannsee is just outside Berlin, where Hitler's top generals met to discuss the final solution. So this list, one of my uncles was on this list.
My brother was on that list. The same brother who had been previously held by the Gestapo. He had been so very ill. He'd been in bed for about 2 months. His entire body was swollen from starvation. with an enormous sacrifice, the rest of us in the family, we tried to give him our minimal food ration, tried our best to get him back on his feet again. We were determined not to let him get captured by the police. When the police arrived in the middle of the night to collect him and found he wasn't there, I was taken instead as a hostage.
My mum sat in prison for 3 weeks for him, and every time her cell door opened, she was sure that would be her last moment. But when he heard that my mum took his place, he gave himself up. But he was, in a sense, lucky because he had been warned, the family had been warned by a Jewish ghetto police who had seen the list of who was going to be next picked up. And that's how they managed to get him for Moshe, my uncle, to escape at that particular moment. Not everybody was that lucky. So those who had been picked up, they were either taken outside to open areas. That happened mostly in the eastern part of Europe. Where they had to dig their own trenches, graves, basically, big trenches. A commander stand on top of the trenches, shot from behind, and they were killed and fell down, and the next line had to come up. That was carried out by the Einsatzgruppen. And those who weren't murdered that way were carted off to the concentration camps, and the chances of surviving in the concentration camp were very slim. Now, 1942, as I said, they were going to deport the sick and the children. My 2 nephews and my 2 cousins, Simon and Jacob, they were in this orphanage, this particular orphanage. And when my mum heard that in the next few days the orphanage was going to be cleared, she had to somehow try and save them.
When I got to the orphanage, all the children ran towards me, clung to me. They all wanted to come home with me. The children were scared. They sensed danger. But when I asked permission to take home my nephews, I got a firm no from the orphanage manager. The children were counted, and he was responsible for the precise number. No argument. Neither my nor the children's tears helped change his mind. I had to leave alone. I had to leave the children. Abandoned, upset, frightened. These were the children's last few hours of life. At dawn, the lorries arrived, loaded all the children and staff on them. And drove them all straight to the gas chamber.
This image never left my mum. She couldn't bear hear children cry. But life had to carry on. The will to live, as my mum said, was strong. And it is now getting closer, 1942, 43, 44. The Soviet army was getting closer towards Warsaw, which was not too far from Lodz. And of course, my mum used to say that every time they heard what they thought was artillery thuds, they were hopeful. Maybe they would be rescued soon. But equally, it made the Nazis even more jumpy, more random killing, more roll calls, just for the sake of it. And in 1944, in June, the Nazis decided they were going to close the ghetto, liquidate the ghetto. And throughout the time, from 1940 to 1944 in August, between approximately 210,000 people went through the ghetto, and only between 7,000 and 10,000 survived. My mum was one of them. So they were told to pack a few things. They were going to be resettled to somewhere nicer. Taken to this station, Marysin, just outside Lodz. And this is what they saw, the famous cattle wagons, where they were forced into them, packed like sardines, with no water, no food, and not being told where to go. And they were and it took several hours to fill a train like that, without any information, and people started to panic. And if they panic, they were given a tiny small piece of bread so that it would make them shut up. And eventually it left, and my mum arrived in Auschwitz on the 16th of August, 1944. And as soon as they got out, being shouted at, raus, get out, schnell, hurry up, as if they could, they fell out, those who could still stand on their two legs. And the selection started. Men to one side, women and children to the other side. But there was a third selection, this one, of mothers with young children, or people who the Nazis deemed old or sick, who were of no use to them. These queues were marched straight to the gas chambers in Auschwitz. My mum was lucky. She was marched to a barrack. This is just a generic barrack because there are no barracks left in Auschwitz to photograph. And as soon as they got into the barracks, they were told to undress. All their body hair was shaved off, and they were painted in my mum described it as foul-smelling ointment, which stung. We think it might have been some paraffin or something, we're not sure.
Once a day, we collected our soup ration with a small bowl we were given. The distribution of that soup was the most degrading thing I had to witness. The prisoners threw themselves over the soup, fought each other, scratched one another so that they bled, stamped on each other's feet, all in an attempt to get as near to the soup as possible, with the aim of getting their hands in and secure some of this life-saving soup. This soup could be the determining factor in deciding who would be the next victim to die of starvation.
It was the indignity of it all. Now there was Dr. Mengele, who was also in Auschwitz. He had totally abandoned his Hippocratic oath. He did exactly the opposite. Went to the lines when they were selected people from the barracks, took them to his clinic and experimented on them. And if you survived, you had the most horrendous pain and nightmares throughout your life. The picture on your right, is taken from one lady who did survive, and that photograph is from the Nuremberg trials, which the Allies started in 1946 to bring the Nazis to justice. Unfortunately, Mengele had managed to escape and never faced the justice.
Auschwitz was hell on earth. A dying infant.
No.
A person who denies all dignity. Was forced as low as the ground. Cruel under the these murderers who represented the deepest darkness slept on that wooden bunk, 8 of us on one. It was so.
Can you read? Can you read instead?
Cramped. If anyone wanted to turn, he had to wait until the person next to her also turned. We were woken often in the middle of the night and ordered outside on a roll call.
Now, my mum was lucky, she said, because she was only there for 1 month. And the reason, we think, is because she had arrived in Auschwitz relatively late, 1944. One day, a few barracks were told to get out, stand in front of the gas chambers. Of course, again, she was sure that was the end. They were not told why. They had to wait for hours. And if they asked for water, the capos, which were prisoners themselves, but had been put in the role of looking after other prisoners, the capos said to them, "You don't need water where you're going." They were sure they were going to be sent to the gas chambers. But the photograph you see here is actually what happened afterwards. After several hours, they were told to go into a room, pick out a pair of shoes, underpants, and a dress, because they had been bought by factories and other areas around Germany who needed more slave labor. So my mum was bought as slave labor, and she was transported to just outside Berlin, Neukölln, where she had to work as a slave labor in an ammunition factory. But when they arrived at the ammunition factory, they were in such a state that the manager, who was a civilian, put them in their own in their own barrack because he didn't want them to infect any of the other workers. And after 2 weeks of so-called quarantine, when they were given 1 meal a day and rested, my mum thought she had arrived in heaven compared to where she had been. But eventually the work started, and it was long hours. And not only that, this is now towards the end of 1944, beginning of 1945. The Allies were bombing day and night. All the other workers, apart from the Jews, were given shelters to hide from the bombs, from the debris and the bombing. Apart from the Jews, they were told, just find somewhere to hide. You're not important enough. But the Germans, the Nazis now started to get a bit concerned because they were getting closer and closer to the Berlin, and they did not want any of the prisoners to be released, because they did not want the secrets of how the ammunition factories and the machinery worked. My mum was again moved to Ravensbrück. The men were taken to Sachsenhausen, which was a men's concentration camp, and my mum to Ravensbrück, further north. But when she arrived in Ravensbrück, conditions were not much better. By then, starvation, diseases were rampant there too. And those who could still work were put to slave labor. But unfortunately, you could say, at this time, the Red Cross was allowed to send food parcels to certain concentration camps and labor camps. The trouble was, in those days, they didn't realize that when you give starving people fatty food, butter, chocolates, they become so desperately ill that some died from that. But conditions, as I said, in Ravensbrück were very difficult too. Similar sleeping conditions. But one day, about middle of April 1945, my mum said it was very quiet outside. They couldn't understand, but they couldn't hear any guards. So they gingerly opened the door from the barrack and looked outside, and there were no guards. They'd gone. So they went out, walked along to the main entrance, and outside they saw a long convoy of white buses. These were the white buses sent as a result of a negotiation between Himmler, one of Hitler's right-hand men on the right, who was now realizing that they were losing the war. Hitler hadn't realized that yet. He was hiding in a bunker. Himmler wanted to escape to do a deal with the Allies. Bernadotte, on the left, who was a representative of the Swedish Red Cross. Now, Sweden had been neutral throughout the war. Denmark and Norway had been occupied, and therefore there were Danish and Norwegian Scandinavian prisoners of war in German concentration and labor camps. Sweden wanted to try and bring them home. So Bernadotte was tasked with the negotiation. Right till the very last day, Himmler refused to also let the Jews go. He held on to them right to the last minute. But eventually, he said, if there are still any room left on the buses, I would let the Jews go as well. And this is how my mum arrived on this ferry in Malmö on the 28th of April 1945. They come off the ferry. All their clothes had to be incinerated. They were covered in lice. But now they were examined by doctors, real doctors, and gentle nurses and doctors. They were treated like human beings suddenly. Anyone who was desperately ill was sent to hospitals. If you were not so bad, you were sent to quarantine, which is where my mum was sent. And here she was in Malmö, in quarantine for a month. And when she got out, didn't speak a language and didn't know anyone. But she found herself a job in a kitchen in a hospital, and she was eating herself back to health. Eventually, she started going out. She met people. She met my dad, a Swedish Jew. They started going out, and in 1948, they got married. I was born a year later, and a year after that, we moved to Israel. My dad has always been a great Zionist. And in Israel, my mum was reunited with 7 of her surviving siblings. Some of those siblings had lost their families, their spouses and children. but they had survived, and they were all living in Israel. And you can see here on the right, my sister was born in Israel, and she's sitting on my dad's lap. But 8 years later, we moved back to Sweden, where my mum got a job as a kindergarten teacher in the Jewish nursery in Malmö. And she loved that work because here were the children, the future. She loved that work. But she had promised herself that she would never give up the opportunity to speak to anybody, everywhere, schools, bar mitzvahs, weddings, anywhere, to tell the story. Because all those millions of Jews who had been murdered, a lot of them had no descendants at all, and their story had to be told somehow to keep their memory alive. And every time we went to visit our family in Israel, we went to the Yad Vashem Museum in Jerusalem, and my mum was always particularly spending time in the children's memorial, and I could always see tears running down her face. Now, the Nazis did not only, and their collaborators did not only kill and persecute Jews. A long list of anybody who was different. These are just my family who perished, but there were many more because my mum really did not couldn't talk about it. And I never found out of all the names of all cousins and aunts of my mum's. These are just the names that I know. But she had her legacy, and that's my sister and myself and our families. She had a chance to meet our spouses, unfortunately, not her great-grandchildren, but nevertheless, she had a positive life. But her dearest wish was always that future generations should learn from the awful experiences that she and millions of others suffered. And that by education, tolerance and love and respect for one another, and she was the most tolerant and respectful person that I know, maybe there is a future if we can follow in her legacy. Thank you so much for listening.